So I want you to do something for a second. If you are listening to this deep dive on a smartphone, or I don't know, maybe it's just sitting right next to you on a desk or on your pocket, just look at it.
Yeah, take a really good look at that little glass and metal rectangle.
Exactly, because you probably use it to, well, scroll through social media or check the weather forecast, maybe text a friend.
Right.
It feels incredibly domestic.
Yeah.
It is like the ultimate civilian tool. It's an everyday object that practically defines modern life.
Oh, absolutely. It's totally ubiquitous.
But, and this is the wild part, consider the invisible architecture inside that device. Like the GPS chip that pinpoints your location on a map. That was originally developed by the Department of Defense to guide submarines and missiles.
Yep.
And the advanced communication networks, like the whole foundation of the internet itself, that was born from military research agencies just trying to create communication lines that could survive a nuclear strike. Even the microprocessors, the digital cameras, they all basically trace their lineage back to a desire for strategic advantage, surveillance warfare.
It is one of those invisible realities that just completely changes how you view the world once you actually notice it.
Right.
Because the most ubiquitous consumer tool on the planet is, at its foundational level, a repurposed military asset.
Yeah, it's wild to think about.
I mean, the engineering brilliance that went into designing intercontinental ballistic missile targeting systems is now being used to optimize the fastest route to a local coffee shop.
It's just crazy.
We basically take the most destructive technologies and over time we just domesticate them into tools of connection.
And that transition, that literal transformation of a technology born for conflict into a technology that facilitates, everyday human connection, that is the perfect launching pad for the source material we are unpacking today.
It really is.
Because we have a fascinating stack of research sitting here, and it focuses entirely on a very specific, highly pragmatic blueprint for the future.
Right, drawn from a much larger document known as the Peaceful World Manifesto.
Exactly. But we aren't looking at the whole thing today. We are going, right under the microscope on a single, incredibly dense section. Point 26.
Point 26, yeah.
It is titled The Transformation of Security, or depending on the translation you're reading, the Planetary Shield.
Which is a phrase that, let's be honest, it sounds like it belongs on the cover of a science fiction novel.
It really does. Something out of a movie.
But the text itself is, it's anything but fantasy. It reads more like an engineering schematic combined with a macroeconomic white paper.
Right.
To set the baseline, the very first line of point 26 literally states, "We have no illusions."
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so it does not ask us to hold hands and sing songs. It explicitly acknowledges that we live in a dangerous universe with real devastating threats.
Right, it's grounded in reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The document is an exploration of how a civilization can structurally survive those threats without, accidentally destroying itself in the process.
Because when you start throwing around terms like transformation of security and planetary shield, it is very easy to get lost in, high-level geopolitical jargon.
Oh, completely. It gets very academic very fast.
So our goal today is to strip away all that academic language. We're going to take these massive concepts, how we defend ourselves, why the mathematics of our current global security system are fundamentally broken, and how we might completely repurpose the greatest engine of innovation on Earth.
And make them totally intuitive.
Exactly. If you can understand how to use the smartphone in your hand, you should be able to understand this blueprint.
Well, to do that, we have to grasp a massive paradigm shift that the text calls moving toward existential risk management, or X-risk for short.
X-risk, got it.
Point 26 argues that the entire apparatus of global defense is currently just pointed in the wrong direction.
How so?
Well, the manifesto explicitly names the actual mathematical threats to the continuation of the human species. And they are asteroids, pandemics, and cascading climate change.
Right, not other countries. Let's look at the math of those threats for a second, because historically, human security has basically always been defined by the threat of other humans.
State versus state.
Right. A nation builds a military to protect its borders from the military of another nation. But the manifesto forces us to step back and realize that an asteroid does not respect a national border.
It definitely doesn't.
A virus does not care about a country's political ideology or its economic output. And climate change certainly does not negotiate peace treaties.
which, exposes a glaring cognitive dissonance in our species.
Yeah.
Because traditional military posturing like amassing armored divisions at a border or developing hypersonic missiles to strike a neighboring capital, that is entirely useless against the threats that actually have the potential to render the Earth uninhabitable.
Right, like the physics of a tank cannot stop a viral mutation.
Exactly. And the aerodynamics of a stealth fighter cannot deflect a near-Earth object.
It's just the wrong tool for the job.
Totally. We are spending trillions of dollars and monopolizing our brightest engineering minds to build complex systems designed to defend humans from other humans, while just leaving the entire biosphere completely exposed to non-human existential threats.
I was actually trying to visualize this structural flaw while I was reading through the research, and I kept picturing Earth as this massive spaceship.
Okay, I like that.
So imagine this spaceship is flying through a dark, highly dangerous asteroid field.
Right.
And inside the ship, the crew is divided into dozens of competing factions. And the engineering teams of these factions are just working frantically around the clock, draining the ship's power grid to build these elaborate internal turrets.
Oh, wow.
They're mounting lasers in the hallways, pointing them directly at the factions down the hall. But because they're so insanely focused on the internal power struggle, no one is looking out the window.
No one's watching the radar.
Exactly. No one is tracking the massive meteors tumbling toward the hull of the ship. The Manifesto is essentially arguing that we need to rip these internal turrets out of the floorboards and point them outward.
Because if the hull of the spaceship is breached by a meteor, it really does not matter which faction had the most advanced internal turrets.
Nope. Game over for everyone.
The environmental seal is broken and everyone perishes equally. The environment we live in, our atmosphere, our oceans, our global supply chains, that is the hull of that ship.
Right.
So pointing weapons at our neighbors inside the spaceship is not just like a diplomatic failure, it is a fatal misallocation of finite resources.
It literally violates basic survival logic. But, and here's where I think a lot of people get hung up, this creates an immediate practical problem.
Here.
Let's say a nation reads this manifesto, agrees with the logic, and decides to dismantle its internal turrets.
Okay.
If they disarm, what stops the faction down the hall, who maybe didn't read the manifesto, right?
Yeah.
From just walking over and taking their resources?
Yeah, the free rider problem.
Exactly. You cannot just build a global society on blind trust.
And the authors of the manifesto know that. They aren't naive. This is where the concept of non-offensive defense, or NOD, comes in.
NOD. Yeah.
Alongside the principle of defensive sufficiency, the text does not advocate for pacifism or the abandonment of defense. It mandates a completely different engineering philosophy.
So it's an engineering solution, not just a policy one.
Right. The goal is to possess exactly enough power to defend oneself while simultaneously creating a structural incapability of offense.
I have to pause here because this is where I heavily scrutinize the source material.
Fair enough.
The idea of a structural incapability of offense, I mean, it sounds great on paper, but how does that actually work in reality?
It's a good question.
Because if a nation builds this impenetrable shield to protect its borders, what prevents that nation's leadership from just taking the heavy metal edge of that shield and using it as a battering ram against a neighbor?
Right, the old shield as a weapon argument.
Yeah. How do you engineer a military system that is physically incapable of attacking?
Well, you do it through the deliberate restriction of logistics, geography, and physics.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Structural incapability is a design constraint. It's built right into the hardware and the supply chains. It means engineering an infrastructure that physically cannot project power across a border.
So what does that constraint look like on, say, a factory floor or a military base?
Let's look at the logistical differences between a long-range strategic bomber and a localized short-range interceptor drone network.
Okay.
A long-range bomber is an inherently offensive platform. It is engineered with massive fuel tanks, mid-air refueling capabilities, and the avionics necessary to fly thousands of miles into foreign airspace, drop a payload, and return.
Right. It's designed to go far away and break things.
Exactly. It requires a massive logistical tail of support aircraft and forward operating bases.
Yeah.
Under the doctrine of non-offensive defense, you simply do not build those.
You just stop making them.
You do not manufacture mid-air refueling tankers. You do not build aircraft carriers, which are essentially just floating offensive power projection cities.
So you are literally starving The military of the logistics required for an invasion.
Precisely. Instead, you pour all those resources into domestic defense.
Like what?
You build dense, localized radar grids. You manufacture millions of short-range interceptor drones.
Okay.
These interceptors might only have a battery life capable of flying, say, 50 miles from their charging stations.
I see.
They are incredibly lethal and effective at neutralizing any hostile aircraft or missile that enters your sovereign airspace. But they physically cannot be used to attack a capital city 3 nations away.
Because they just don't have the juice.
Right. If they try to cross the border, their batteries deplete and they literally drop out of the sky.
Wow. It is geographically limiting the physics of the weapon.
Exactly.
Going back to our smartphone analogy, it's like deciding you need to protect your phone.
Yeah.
You don't build malicious software to hack other people's devices to keep yourself safe. You just buy an incredibly heavy-duty, reinforced, shock-absorbent phone case.
That's a great way to put it.
That case gives you defensive sufficiency. If you drop the phone, it survives. If someone tries to crush it, the case holds.
Yeah.
But the physical design of that case cannot be used to hack into the phone of the person sitting next to you on the bus.
Exactly. It protects you perfectly, but it poses absolutely zero threat to your neighbor.
That is so intuitive when you frame it like that.
And consider how that physical reality alters the global geopolitical psychology.
Oh, man. Yeah.
If every nation invests heavily in indestructible phone cases, but structurally dismantles their hacking tools, the global anxiety level just plummets.
Because you literally don't have to worry.
Right. You no longer have to spend your intellectual and economic capital worrying about what your neighbor might do because they lack the physical capacity to breach your borders, even if their leadership secretly wanted to.
But, okay, that creates a fascinating paradox.
Let's hear it.
If we structurally neuter our offensive capabilities,
Right.
and we build this impenetrable fortress, don't we just become isolationists? Because historically, nations use the threat of force-like offensive deterrence to secure resources, influence global markets, and just ensure their citizens feel safe.
Sure.
If we can't project fear, how does a state ensure its own long-term security in a really complex world?
That exact paradox is what forces the next logical evolution in the Manifesto's blueprint.
Okay.
If you cannot project fear, you must project value.
Project value.
Yes. Point 26 declares a paradigm shift from state security to human security and ultimately to common security. It argues that true safety is found in security with others, not against them.
We need to define those terms really clearly because state security and human security are often in direct opposition to one another in the real world.
They absolutely are. Historically, the abstraction of the state has secured its borders by impoverishing the actual humans living within them.
Give me an example of that.
Well, a government might allocate hundreds of billions of dollars to construct a fleet of nuclear submarines, stealth fighters, and a massive standing army.
Right.
The state, as a political entity, is incredibly secure against foreign invasion. But to fund that security, the humans living inside the state might be deprived of basic health care, resilient infrastructure, or quality education.
So the border is perfectly safe, but the human is deeply insecure.
Exactly. They're vulnerable to preventable disease, economic collapse, or a natural disaster.
The citizens are protected from a hypothetical foreign military, but they are in daily tangible danger from their own crumbling domestic systems.
Right. Human security completely flips that priority. It posits that a nation is only truly secure when its population is healthy, educated, and economically resilient.
That makes sense.
But common security takes the mathematics of survival a step further.
How so?
It recognizes that you are mathematically safer when your neighbor is stable, fed, and healthy. Because desperation breeds conflict. If the country next door is collapsing from famine, resource depletion, or economic ruin, that instability will inevitably spill over your borders.
Right. Crisis doesn't stay neatly contained.
No matter how dense your grid of short-range interceptor drones is, a collapsing neighboring state is a direct threat to your own stability.
I want to push back on the economics of that, though.
Go for it.
The idea that, a rising tide lifts all boats is a really nice sentiment. But applied to geopolitics, it sounds incredibly expensive.
It does.
If my security relies on making sure my neighbor's population is fed and their infrastructure is stable, aren't we essentially paying a geopolitical extortion fee?
Extortion fee.
Yeah, like
Right.
we are subsidizing their stability just so they don't become a problem for us.
Well, the manifesto argues it isn't extortion, it is the deployment of smart power.
Smart power.
Yes, which the text explicitly advocates for. Smart power is the synthesis of soft power things, like cultural influence, diplomatic ties, technological exchange, and humanitarian aid combined with the defensive sufficiency we just discussed.
Okay, so it's a combo.
Right. You aren't just handing over cash blindly, you are weaving an intricate web of mutual dependencies.
How does that mutual dependency act as a defense mechanism, practically speaking?
You make your nation so inherently vital to the global ecosystem through trade, medical innovation, ecological restoration, technological infrastructure, that attacking you becomes economically and socially disastrous for the attacker.
Oh, I see.
Instead of a geopolitical landscape based on mutually assured destruction, you engineer a landscape of mutually assured prosperity.
Wow.
If a hostile actor tries to destabilize you, they inevitably crash their own supply chains, their own medical networks, and their own technological grids in the process.
So projecting value actually becomes the ultimate defense mechanism.
Seriously.
But realistically, achieving that level of global human security, like building out the infrastructure for a common security network, developing advanced domestic defenses, solving the root causes of resource desperation, that requires an astronomical amount of capital.
It really does.
Where does the funding for this massive global overhaul come from?
The funding already exists.
Right. Really, where?
It is just currently tied up in the machinery of mutually assured destruction. The Manifesto dictates that we completely repurpose the greatest engine of innovation, logistics, and capital on Earth, the military-industrial complex.
Okay, and this is where we hit the core concept of the Planetary Shield.
Yes.
The text insists on redirecting our massive military potential to create a planetary defense and restoration industry.
That's the phrase?
And it heavily emphasizes the intentional development of what it calls dual-use technologies.
Right.
So these are systems designed to serve ecology, medicine, and human security in peacetime, but then they immediately pivot to become humanity's shield during a cataclysm or an existential threat.
Exactly. Dual use is a term that often gets buried in, like, really boring bureaucratic defense reports. But it is the critical bridge between the world we currently inhabit and the world Point 26 envisions.
We touched on this at the very beginning with the smartphone, but dual-use technology is deeply woven into our everyday lives, usually just by historical accident.
Oh, totally.
I want to dig into those everyday examples because understanding how it has happened by accident helps us understand how the Manifesto wants us to do it on purpose.
That's a good approach.
So explain this concept like I'm a school child who uses a smartphone every day. Take something as mundane as the microwave in your kitchen.
Oh, the microwave is the perfect illustration of a military-to-civilian pipeline.
Right, because the core component that heats up your food is a vacuum tube called a magnetron.
Yep.
And magnetrons were aggressively developed and refined during World War II. Their original purpose was to power military radar systems.
Right, bouncing high-frequency radio waves off incoming enemy bombers to detect them across the English Channel.
It was a tool of pure state defense.
Exactly.
But after the war, engineers realized that the exact same radar waves used to track a bomber could excite water molecules and cook food with incredible speed.
A technology of war literally became an appliance of domestic convenience.
It's amazing. Or consider the medical applications. Look at superglue.
Oh, yeah. Superglue is a crazy story.
Most of us just use cyanoacrylate adhesive superglue to, fix a broken coffee mug or a piece of plastic trim.
Right.
But during the Vietnam War, a variation of that adhesive was utilized as a rapid, life-saving medical tool.
Yeah, medics carried it in spray form.
Exactly. They used it to instantly seal open combat wounds right on the battlefield. It stopped catastrophic bleeding long enough for a soldier to survive a medevac flight.
And now a chemical compound engineered for battlefield trauma triage is hanging on a rack at every local hardware store.
It's dual use in action. And of course, the smartphone, which really represents the absolute apex of dual-use potential.
Completely. Just think about the camera array, the GPS tracking, the instant access to global communication networks.
Yeah.
In the hands of a military operator, that device can be used to paint a target and coordinate a highly precise kinetic strike.
Yeah.
But in the hands of a civilian emergency responder, that exact same architecture coordinates rescue logistics. It pinpoints the locations of stranded families on rooftops during a catastrophic flood.
So the Manifesto is basically arguing that we need to stop waiting for these dual-use benefits to just happen by accident decades after a conflict.
Exactly. Instead, it mandates that dual use becomes the primary intentional design philosophy for all future global security investments.
Wow.
It envisions an economy where the trillions of dollars currently funneled into defense research are poured into technologies that actively heal the planet and its population on a daily basis.
But they still possess the inherent engineering to save the human race from a macro threat when required.
Precisely. You don't lose the defense, you just change its primary application.
The research specifically points to modern drones and artificial intelligence as the vanguard of this new planetary defense and restoration industry.
They are the key technologies, yeah.
Let's break down the mechanics of how that transition works, starting with drones. Because currently, when the public hears the word drone in a geopolitical context, they visualize a weapon.
Oh, absolutely. They think of a high-altitude, unmanned machine carrying Hellfire missiles over a conflict zone.
Right. So how do you repurpose that specific infrastructure?
You repurpose it by changing the payload and the software architecture while retaining the incredibly advanced aerospace engineering, the manufacturing supply lines, and the operational logistics.
So you don't throw the drone away.
No, not at all. Consider the heavy-lift, long-endurance drones utilized by modern militaries.
Oh.
These are highly sophisticated machines. They're engineered to carry hundreds of pounds of equipment across unforgiving terrain in severe weather conditions, staying aloft for days at a time.
Incredible machines.
Point 26 dictates that we remove the kinetic payloads. We literally strip out the missiles and the targeting lasers, and we retrofit those exact same airframes for medical logistics and rapid emergency response.
So the giant defense contractors, the Lockheed Martins and the Boeings of the world, they don't go out of business.
No, they just pivot their assembly lines from building strike platforms to building global humanitarian supply networks.
The factories stay open, the aerospace engineers keep their jobs.
Exactly. But imagine the deployment of a decentralized drone network blanketing a vulnerable region under this human security model.
Paint that picture for me.
Say a hiker is bitten by a highly venomous snake on a remote, densely forested mountain trail where a traditional helicopter cannot safely land.
Okay.
Or an individual in a rural, infrastructure-poor village goes into sudden cardiac arrest.
In both of those cases, traditional emergency services might take hours to reach them, if they can reach them at all.
Exactly. But an autonomous military-grade medical drone can be dispatched instantly.
Wow.
Flying at hundreds of miles per hour, completely unhindered by traffic, difficult terrain, or a lack of roads, it delivers anti-venom, a defibrillator, or even a desperately needed organ for transplant directly to the GPS coordinates pinging from the caller's smartphone.
So we are talking about reducing response times from hours to minutes.
We are.
And what happens when the threat scales up? Let's say one of those existential risks activates,
Right.
like a massive 8.5 magnitude earthquake levels a major metropolitan area.
That is when the dual-use nature of the Planetary Shield activates at scale.
Okay, how does that work?
Instead of deploying military divisions to establish martial law or secure borders, you deploy swarms of these repurposed aerospace platforms.
Drone swarms.
Yes, a swarm of low-altitude drones flies over the devastated city. They utilize advanced military thermal imaging technology originally calibrated to detect enemy combatants hiding in dense jungle foliage, right?
Right.
But now they use it to pinpoint the faint heat signatures of survivors buried beneath tons of collapsed concrete.
That is amazing.
And simultaneously, a swarm of high-altitude solar-powered drones circles in the stratosphere above the city.
What are they doing up there?
They act as flying networked cell towers. They instantly project a localized Wi-Fi and cellular communications grid down to the emergency responders and trapped civilians.
Bypassing the fact that all the ground-based terrestrial cell towers have just been destroyed by the earthquake.
Exactly. You are utilizing the exact same technological backbone designed for military reconnaissance and battlefield communication, but you are weaving it into a massive rapid response safety net.
You maintain the robust, highly capable technological infrastructure of a military-industrial complex. But the military aspect is entirely redirected toward planetary defense and human preservation.
It's brilliant in its pragmatism.
And what about the computational side of this? Because artificial intelligence is the other massive pillar mentioned in the text.
This AI is crucial.
Right now, global powers are basically racing to develop AI to analyze satellite imagery for intelligence gathering, or to automate cyber warfare, or to model enemy troop movements with unprecedented speed.
Under the doctrines of Point 26, that immense planet-spanning computational power is redirected toward the mitigation of X risks.
Give me an example of what that looks like.
Well, instead of a neural network predicting where an enemy tank division will reposition, the AI is fed massive data sets of real-time environmental telemetry.
Like weather data.
Yes, barometric pressure, wind velocity, humidity levels, the exact density of dry brush across thousands of square miles.
Oh.
The AI models this data to predict exactly where a mega wildfire will spread over the next 48 hours.
Wow.
It calculates the fire's trajectory faster and more accurately than any human meteorologist ever could. And then it automatically coordinates autonomous firefighting aircraft to pre-saturate the exact zones where the fire will be.
Cutting off the fuel supply before the flames ever even arrive.
Exactly. It's proactive defense.
The text also explicitly mentions pandemics as an X-risk. How does the AI Planetary Shield address a biological threat?
By analyzing data at a scale that is simply incomprehensible to human epidemiologists.
Okay, like what kind of data?
The AI continuously processes millions of global medical scans, anonymized hospital intake records, global pharmaceutical supply chain fluctuations, and even municipal wastewater samples.
It's monitoring the sewage.
Yes, looking for microscopic anomalies. It might detect a tiny, statistically unusual cluster of atypical respiratory infections in a remote transit hub halfway across the world.
Right.
It flags the anomaly and cross-references it with global travel patterns months before a human organization like the CDC or the WHO would have enough data to recognize a pattern.
So you identify and contain the biological threat when it is still just a local anomaly.
Before it ever scales into a global pandemic.
I mean, I see the sheer logistical beauty of this vision. It is an inspiring use of technology.
It really is.
However,
Yeah, here's the however.
yeah, if we're talking about handing over our emergency response infrastructure, our global resource logistics, and our medical triage systems, advanced artificial intelligence, and autonomous drone swarms, I have to admit, it introduces a terrifying new vector of vulnerability.
It certainly does.
If we build a planetary shield powered by autonomous software, and a machine is calculating who needs to be rescued first, or where the fire suppression resources are deployed, who decides when the machine crosses a line?
Your hesitation is incredibly valid, and honestly, the architects of this manifesto anticipated it.
Did they?
Yes. This brings us to the final and arguably the most philosophically vital component of point 26.
Okay.
The ultimate red line. The principle of meaningful human control.
Right. I noticed the source material is remarkably strict on this issue.
Extremely strict.
It states that while the manifesto fully champions the rapid advancement of defense technologies, it absolutely demands adherence to the precautionary principle and meaningful human control.
Yep.
The exact phrasing in the text is quite chilling, actually. It says decisions about life and death must never be handed over to algorithms or autonomous systems.
It is a hard, non-negotiable boundary. The designers of this blueprint understood that technology is a double-edged sword. If you construct a planetary shield managed by omniscient AI, you run the severe risk of accidentally engineering a technocracy where algorithms dictate the parameters of human survival.
I am going to play devil's advocate here for a second because I really want to challenge the efficiency of this red line.
Go ahead.
Let's return to our earthquake scenario.
Okay.
The city is in ruins. The AI Grome swarm is scanning the rubble with thermal imaging. The algorithm detects 2 trapped individuals.
A classic triage problem.
Exactly. Person A is a healthy 20-year-old trapped beneath a relatively light beam. The AI calculates a 90% probability of survival if rescue teams are deployed in the next hour.
Okay.
Person B is an 80-year-old trapped under a massive structural slab. The AI calculates a 10% probability of survival and determines that extracting them will require heavy machinery, taking 5 hours and tying up resources that could be used elsewhere.
It's a brutal scenario.
Very brutal. Now, mathematically, logically, the AI calculates that redirecting all available resources to rescue the 20-year-old first maximizes the overall probability of preserving human life in the disaster zone.
Right.
It's an emotionally cold calculation, but it is mathematically flawless.
It is.
If an AI is empirically proven to be faster, more objective, and theoretically capable of saving more lives overall by ruthlessly optimizing resource allocation, why shouldn't we let the machine make the final call?
It's a tough question.
Why handicap the efficiency of our shiny new planetary shield by relying on slow, emotional, inherently biased human brains to approve the operation?
That is basically the defining ethical dilemma of our era.
Yeah.
And to unpack why the Manifesto rejects the efficiency above all argument, we have to examine the philosophical foundation of point 26.
Okay, where do we start?
First, we must address the precautionary principle.
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
This principle dictates that when a society is dealing with innovations that carry potential existential harm, like granting an AI system the authority to make life or death triage choices, the burden of proof falls entirely on those who wish to deploy the technology.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning they have to prove it is flawlessly safe in all conceivable scenarios. You do not deploy autonomous lethal or triage systems into the wild and wait for a catastrophic failure to occur in order to patch the software.
Right. The whole Silicon Valley ethos of move fast and break things is fundamentally incompatible when the things being broken are human lives.
Precisely. But the deeper, more profound answer lies in what we might call the morality of the algorithm.
The morality of the algorithm, I like that.
Why is meaningful human control the absolute cornerstone of this entire defense architecture? Because an algorithm, regardless of its processing power or its neural network complexity, does not comprehend the sanctity of biological life.
He doesn't know what life is.
Exactly. It does not understand fear or love or dignity or grief. It merely optimizes a spreadsheet. It seeks the mathematical maximum of a programmed function.
It is literally just calculating variables.
It is just math. If an AI autonomously decides who receives a medical drone delivery and who is left to die based on a cold statistical calculation of survival probabilities and resource optimization, it strips humanity of its moral agency.
How does that impact the humans on the ground?
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean for the person who actually has to execute the rescue?
It means that any decision resulting in life or death must carry the weight of human conscience.
Right.
It must retain the capacity for regret, and it must bear the burden of accountability.
Wow.
If a human rescue commander looks at the AI's data analysis, weighs the terrible options, and makes the agonizing decision to save the 20-year-old over the 80-year-old, that human commander has to live with the moral weight of that choice.
Yeah, they will feel the sting of regret.
They will eventually have to look the family of the 80-year-old in the eye and explain their reasoning.
A machine cannot feel regret. It cannot sit with the grief of its calculations.
A machine feels absolutely nothing. Once the calculation is executed, it simply moves to the next data set.
Right.
And a society that offloads its most agonizing life and death moral choices to a machine incapable of feeling regret is a society that has forfeited its own humanity.
That's heavy.
If there is no capacity for grief, empathy, or moral accountability built into the system becomes inherently tyrannical, regardless of its mathematical efficiency.
So it's about preserving what makes us human.
Therefore, the Manifesto draws an immovable line in the sand. A machine cannot be given the final authority on triage. An algorithm cannot hold the trigger.
So the AI is a tool, not the commander.
Exactly. AI can rapidly analyze data, it can advise human operators, drone swarms can execute the physical logistics of delivery, but the final authorization to act, especially when human life hangs in the balance, must always originate from a human being capable of bearing the moral responsibility of that action.
That is an incredibly profound way to frame it.
I think so too.
It suggests that our human vulnerability, our emotional friction, our capacity to feel deep pain over an impossible choice, that isn't a bug that needs to be optimized out of the system.
Not at all.
That friction is the vital safeguard. It is what keeps us human.
It is the ultimate firewall. The
Right.
Planetary Shield is constructed from advanced technology, but its operating core must be the human conscience.
Right.
Without meaningful human control, the shield ceases to be a tool of protection and simply becomes a highly efficient cage.
Wow. Well, we have covered an immense expanse of conceptual territory today. We have moved from the macro physics of global defense all the way down to the microethics of algorithmic triage.
It's a lot to process.
It really is. I want to synthesize all these threads because it really does form a single cohesive argument about the future of our species.
The architecture of Point 26 demands a complete reimagining of our relationship with security, technology, and each other.
So we started by looking at the reality of the threats we face, the X risks like asteroids, runaway climate change, and global pandemics. We recognize the absolute absurdity of pointing our greatest technological achievements at each other while the spaceship we all live on flies through a hostile universe.
The spaceship analogy holds up.
That realization necessitates the transition to non-offensive defense. We have to engineer military systems that possess defensive sufficiency, but are structurally, physically incapable of projecting offensive power.
which forces us to abandon fear-based deterrence.
Exactly. If we cannot secure ourselves through the threat of violence, we must secure ourselves through the creation of value.
Right.
We shift from the outdated concept of state security to human security, building webs of common security where our own safety is inextricably linked to the health, stability, and prosperity of our neighbors.
And to fund that monumental shift, we take the trillions of dollars and the massive logistical power of the military-industrial complex and pivot it,
We create an industry of planetary defense and restoration.
relying heavily on dual-use technologies.
We strip the missiles off our drones and turn them into autonomous medical delivery swarms. We take the AI designed for warfare and use it to predict wildfires and detect pandemics. We basically build a shield.
But as we build that shield, we acknowledge the danger of the tools we are using.
Right.
We enforce the precautionary principle and mandate meaningful human control, ensuring that the cold efficiency of the algorithm never usurps the moral agency, the conscience, and the necessary regret of the human heart.
It is a comprehensive, intensely pragmatic blueprint for a civilization attempting to survive its own technological adolescence.
That's a perfect summary.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring it all back to where we started.
Okay.
I want you to think about that smartphone again. The device you are likely holding or sitting near right now.
The everyday dual-use tool.
We discussed how it is the ultimate example of dual-use technology, an incredibly powerful tool born from military research that now manages your personal connection to the global network.
It is the literal manifestation of these vast technological systems distilled into a civilian interface.
So, if the blueprint for a peaceful, surviving world requires absolute, meaningful human control to prevent algorithms from dictating the parameters of human life on a macro scale,
Yeah.
I want you to ask yourself a question about your micro scale.
Oh, this is good.
In your everyday life, are you in meaningful control of the algorithms on the device in your hand?
That's a real question.
When you look at your feeds, your recommendations, your notifications, are you directing the technology, or is the technology beginning to direct you?
Are you making the choices, or is the algorithm optimizing your behavior for its own efficiency?
Exactly. Because the defense of the planet and the massive transition to a truly secure world might actually begin with how you choose to manage the technology and the algorithms in your very own pocket.
I couldn't agree more.
Keep questioning the systems around you, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.